January 1945. A military hospital near Luxembourg City. Inside the long, drafty ward, rows of iron cots line the white walls. Cold winter light cuts through the high windows, illuminating the pale faces of wounded men resting under heavy green blankets. The sharp scent of antiseptic and damp wool fills the air. A young corporal sits upright in his bed, staring down at his right side. His sleeve is pinned flat against his chest. A famous four-star general enters the room, moving slowly from cot to greet the casualties. The corporal reacts instantly, his face flushing red as he struggles to lift his remaining hand. He offers a desperate, clumsy left-hand salute. The entire ward falls dead silent. The general stops directly in front of him. What happens next will change the way every soldier in that room views the true cost of their sacrifice. This is the story of what happened when General George S. Patton encountered a severely wounded soldier who could no longer follow standard military protocol, and how a legendary commander chose to bridge the gap between rigid army discipline and raw human respect. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show humanity in the darkest places. Corporal Michael Torres was a 21-year-old from Albuquerque, New Mexico. Before the war, he was a star pitcher for his hometown high school baseball team. Known across the state for a lightning-fast right-handed throw, he enlisted in the United States Army with the hope of returning to the diamond after victory in Europe. Instead, while serving with the Third Army during the Winter Campaign, a German 88mm artillery shell exploded near his foxhole, tearing his dominant right arm to pieces. Doctors amputated the limb above the elbow just 4 days before. He was right-handed for his entire life, relying on that arm to eat, to write letters home to his mother, and to perform every basic duty of a soldier. Now, he sat propped up against the cold metal frame of a hospital bed, staring blankly at the empty space where his future used to be, waiting for a routine inspection that felt more like a trial. Major Donald Vance was a 42-year-old chief medical administrator from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, stationed at the Luxembourg Field Hospital. Vance wore a perfectly tailored officer wool coat. His boots shined to a mirror gloss, despite the thick mud churning just outside the hospital doors. He viewed the ward not as a place of healing, but as a factory of regulations where everything had to run according to the strict book of Army codes. Vance openly believed that injuries were no excuse for a breakdown in military discipline or a lapse in proper protocol. He walked the concrete floor with a rigid posture, constantly checking his clipboard, firmly convinced that maintaining an unblemished administrative record was far more important than the individual comfort of the mangled men resting under his authority. By January 1945, the European theater had dissolved into a brutal war of attrition. The Ardennes offensive had pushed Allied resources to their absolute limits, leaving thousands of young American soldiers dead or severely mutilated in the freezing mud of the Western Front. Field hospitals across the region were completely overwhelmed, operating around the clock under terrible conditions to salvage what remained of the frontline troops. Medical supplies were dangerously low. Space was a luxury, and the constant influx of fresh casualties created a state of permanent crisis inside every makeshift ward. In this chaotic environment, administrative order often became the only tool left for rear echelon officers who were desperate to maintain control over a situation that was rapidly unraveling. Many commanding officers and hospital administrators chosen to overlook minor infractions during this stressful period, recognizing that men who had just lost limbs or watched their closest comrades die could not be expected to maintain strict garrison standards. The realities of the battlefield had forced a temporary truce between rigid military textbooks and practical human survival. Minor lapses in uniform regulations, missing salutes, and informal speech were routinely tolerated by doctors who were far more concerned with stopping infections than enforcing superficial army customs. Yet, under the surface of this shared understanding, an underlying friction remained between those who fought the enemy and those who managed the paperwork. The field hospital near Luxembourg City became the central point where these two conflicting worldviews were about to collide. While the frontline units continued to bleed in the snow, the clean, heated corridors of the medical administration building remained entirely detached from the raw agony experienced by the patients in the wards. The stage was set for an immediate confrontation, as an upcoming high-level inspection threatened to expose the deep divide between bureaucratic expectations and the harsh physical reality of the wounded men. Major Vance entered the recovery ward 10 minutes before the scheduled inspection, his clipboard gripped tightly under his arm. He stopped at the foot of Corporal Torres's bed, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the young soldier's unbuttoned collar. He demanded to know why the corporal was slouching in his rack during a general inspection. Torres cleared his throat, adjusting himself slightly against the pillows, and explained that his stitches were pulling hard across his chest, and he could not sit completely upright without tearing them. Major Vance tapped his pen against the wooden board, stating that a soldier of the United States Army maintains his military bearing at all times, regardless of his physical condition. The head ward nurse, Lieutenant Clara Evans, stepped between the major and the bed, her face tense. She quietly informed the major that Corporal Torres had been out of surgery for less than 96 hours and was currently under heavy sedation for extreme phantom pain. Major Vance ignored her completely, leaning closer to the young man. He told the corporal that General Patton was currently touring the hospital and expected every single man to present themselves as true infantrymen, not as undisciplined boys. Torres looked up, his voice cracking, and said he understood the order, but his right hand was gone. Major Vance stared directly at the pinned sleeve and responded coldly, stating that regulations did not change because a man lacked a limb, and that every soldier in the ward would figure out a way to show proper respect to a 4-star general or face immediate disciplinary action for insubordination. Lieutenant Evans spoke up louder, stating that the major was crossing a line and that these men had given everything they had on the front lines. Major Vance turned on her sharply, raising his voice just enough to carry across the quiet room. He declared that he was the chief administrator of this facility, that rules were the only things keeping the Army from collapsing into chaos, and that he would not have his perfect record ruined by a ward full of sloppy casualties. He ordered her to step aside and told Torres that when the commander arrived, he would see a proper military greeting, or there would be severe consequences for the entire medical staff. Torres sank back into his pillow, his face pale and sweating as the pressure of the moment weighed down on him. The other wounded men in the surrounding beds watched the exchange in silence, their eyes filled with anger, but unable to intervene against a superior officer. Major Vance adjusted his uniform coat, checked his watch, and stepped back toward the main aisle of the ward to wait. Realizing that this situation was entirely out of her control, and that the major was prepared to punish a mutilated soldier, Lieutenant Evans immediately left the ward to find the hospital director and report the incident up the chain of command. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton's jeep pulled up to the hospital entrance. 4 stars gleamed on his helmet, and the famous ivory revolvers rested on his belt. The general walked into the recovery ward unannounced, his boots striking the floor with a rhythmic, heavy thud. Every man in the room instantly registered his presence, shifting their eyes toward the doorway as a tense silence blanketed the long room. He did not raise his voice. He walked directly to the foot of Corporal Torres's bed, where Major Vance stood rigid at attention. Patton looked at the major, then looked down at the young corporal, who was sweating under his blanket. Patton studied him. The general stood entirely still for a long moment before he spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried to the farthest corners of the ward. He asked Major Vance to state the exact nature of the difficulty in this room. Vance replied that Corporal Torres was refusing to sit up straight and was failing to render a proper military greeting to a superior officer. Patton asked if the major believed that garrison discipline should take precedence over fresh surgical stitches. Vance answered that regulations required a uniform standard of respect from every soldier, regardless of the circumstances. Patton asked the major what he expected a man to do when the hand he used for saluting was left behind on a battlefield. Vance remained silent, his face tightening as the general's eyes locked onto him. Patton addressed the administrator directly. He noted that the major had spent the winter inside a warm office, surrounded by clean paperwork and flawless files. He stated that the major seemed to think that the United States Army was built out of regulations and immaculate uniforms. He pointed at Corporal Torres, whose right sleeve was pinned flat to his chest. He stated that this corporal had given his throwing arm to stop an enemy artillery round while the major was busy polishing his boots. He concluded by telling the major that a man who has left a piece of his own body in the mud of the Ardennes has already paid his respects to this country in full. Patton gave the major a binary choice. He could either learn how to recognize real sacrifice right now, or he could spend the rest of the winter performing his administrative duties in an unheated tent at the most forward supply dump on the front line. Major Vance stood completely motionless, his face turning pale as he chose to remain silent. The general turned away from the major and looked back down at the wounded corporal. The entire room remained dead silent as Patton locked eyes with the young soldier from New Mexico. He slowly raised his own left hand to his brow, crisp and deliberate, mirroring the corporal's improper greeting. The four-star general stood at absolute attention, holding the left-handed salute for a long beat, while every man in the ward watched in disbelief. He dropped his arm and took Torres's remaining left hand in a firm grip, stating that it was the finest salute he had received in the entire war. The corporal tried to explain through tears that it was the wrong hand, but Patton stopped him immediately, stating that any hand rendering a salute from a man who had given the other one for his country was the right hand. The hospital ward instantly erupted into a deafening roar of cheers and applause, with bedridden men banging their metal frames in approval. Major Vance stood completely ignored in the center of the room, his rigid authority shattered in front of his entire staff. Patton gave the young pitcher one final nod before turning on his heel and marching out of the facility, leaving a transformed ward behind him. Corporal Michael Torres returned home to Albuquerque, New Mexico, after his discharge from the service later that year. He could never play baseball again, but he learned to write, eat, and drive with his remaining left hand, eventually marrying his high school sweetheart and raising 3 children. He worked for 40 years as a clerk for the local county government, living a quiet, modest life until his passing in 2005. He never threw another pitch, but he kept the hospital pajamas with the pinned right sleeve in a cedar chest in his bedroom for the rest of his life, showing it only to his grandchildren while repeating the story of the general who met him halfway. Major Donald Vance was quietly reassigned to a remote administrative post in western France 3 weeks after the incident, his hopes for a rapid promotion entirely destroyed by the official hospital report. He remained in the military bureaucracy until 1948, when he retired to a quiet, bitter civilian life as an accountant in Pennsylvania, refusing to ever speak about his time under Patton's command to his family or his neighbors. He died alone in 1974. Patton himself never recorded the hospital encounter in his personal diary, or mentioned the left-handed salute in his official correspondence with his superiors in Washington. He kept the memory entirely out of his public memoirs, though his driver later noted that the general kept a small, handwritten medical report about Corporal Torres tucked inside the leather liner of his briefcase until the day he died. He once remarked to an aide that a true leader must know exactly when to break the rules to preserve the men who have to fight the war. Some historians have argued that General Patton's public defiance of hospital regulations and military protocol during his visit undermined the basic structure of command discipline required to manage a massive wartime organization. They contend that allowing individual commanders to alter long-standing service rules on a whim sets a dangerous precedent that can lead to administrative confusion across the wider military network. Other military analysts have argued the exact opposite, maintaining that true leadership requires the flexibility to look past superficial rules when dealing with men who have sacrificed their own flesh on the front line. What is certain is that the encounter left a permanent mark on the collective memory of the veteran community, serving as a concrete example of a high commander recognizing the heavy human price of tactical victory. If you had been in General Patton's position inside that hospital ward, would you have mirrored the corporal's left-handed salute to show your deep respect? Or would you have simply corrected his military form according to the standard Army regulation book? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to hear more historical World War II stories that show humanity in the darkest places, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now.